This book grew out of a question that was little more than a footnote to begin with, and it became a couple of pages long and then a chapter, and eventually it grew into a whole research project that spanned multiple empires and multiple centuries. For my first book, I'd been working on a history of the settlement of the colony of Georgia in 18th century British America, and I'd come across this expectation in Georgia that the women settling the province were expected to grow raw silk. And the more I looked into it, the more I found this wasn't just an ambition that was confined to one colony or one moment. It was something that had left footprints all over the history of the Atlantic world. So what excited me about this was the chance to explore a history of failure. So much about how we teach and understand the Atlantic world depends on narratives of success, of development or evolution. And I think that's partly natural. That's how we build history. There's the famous adage that, history is written by the winners. And in Atlantic terms, the classic commercial winners were the likes of gold and sugar, tobacco, rice, and of course cotton. And all of these have huge bibliographies, and rightly so. But the challenge I set myself in this book was to turn that inside out, to pull together all of the many fragments and experiments and ideas and investments that were directed towards raising silkworms and creating raw silk in the Americas, trying to suspend what I knew, which was that these were ultimately commercially unsuccessful. The first challenge was figuring out why raw silk failed in these different places, and in some cases it came down to questions of temperature or of oceanic transport, because you have to nurture these incredibly fragile creatures and wind off their silk filaments. In other cases it came down to having the right people, having the right expertise or labour conditions, which was hard to secure in colonial outposts and plantations. So getting this whole production system across the Atlantic Ocean was a huge ask, even for the Spanish and French who had secured silk production in their European landscapes. Far from abandoning the pursuit though, what I found was that projectors rolled up their sleeves. They saw all these creative ways to combat difficulties, and they were pushed on above all by the huge demand for silk products and the growth of big European silk industries. We think of Lyon in France or Spitalfields in London, who were desperate for more and more of the raw material. So the dream of silk ended up being expressed in all these wonderful, kaleidoscopic, imaginative ways that invoke shifting ideas about production, science, gender, revolution. And I think what we end up with when we watch these trials unravelling one by one is a real sense of the experimental energy and of the improvisation that were hallmarks of colonial settlement. And they involve not just the big names, people like James I and Benjamin Franklin. They involve lots of ordinary people, producers like Mixtecan Native Americans in Central America, Huguenots and enslaved Africans in South Carolina. A common feature that I emphasise throughout the work, though, is that women were at the forefront of much of this experimentalism. I guess my favourite insights from the work come from the kinds of stories of frustration, which I think we can all sympathise with, as ordinary people grappled with how they might seize opportunities or adapt their households to these legions of tiny insects. They fashion new buildings, new clothing, they create new laws and practices that we don't maybe think of as part of the colonial experience. And they might not have generated huge quantities of output, but they did plant millions of mulberry trees, and they appropriated silkworms in interesting ways into their domestic habits. So what I hope readers will take away is that there's more for us to find in these kinds of abandoned pursuits. If we want to generate a 360-degree sense of the character of the Atlantic world, including what made it distinctive, then we need to embrace these kinds of histories of failure. And I think the more we look around the world near us today, the more important it becomes that we confront failure, confront environmental determinism, and try to link microhistories to larger patterns.